I recently finished a video comparing the Nintendo 64 and its games against the GameCube. While the latter overall had a better game lineup, there's something to be said about the former hitting a high level of excellence with a select few games on the system. And that's something, seeing as the Nintendo 64 only had 393 games released during its run from 1996 through 2002 in North America. For comparison, the NES and SNES had 768 and 725 respectively, and the PS1 during the same generation as the Nintendo 64 had roughly 1100. Heck, even the GameCube had 650 games released for it, though I'd argue this larger list for the GameCube is due partly from being easier to develop for, there being less limitations for the GameCube, and honestly, more middling shovelware. If you've ever seen any top 10 list video for the Nintendo 64 and know the games library for this console even a little bit, you're probably going to be able to easily guess my number one selection. So with that said, the rules for my list here will be that I'm going to start off with my number one choice and work backwards. Beyond that, only rule is Nintendo 64 games are the only ones that will count towards this list. So let's get stepping into my top 10 with the most obvious number one, which is Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, released November 21st, 1998. And of course this game is in the number one slot. It is objectively the best video game ever made, according to Metacritic, fan praise, and most importantly for this list, my opinion. The bones of the gameplay are very similar to the SNES entry of Link to the Past. Get 3 main quest items, use them to get the Master Sword, then get a larger number of main quest items to unlock the main villain's tower. But why fix what wasn't broken? Link to the Past is the best of the 2D Zelda games, and using that model was a great way to safely break Link into the unknown world of the third dimension. Perfect story, great characters, fantastic music, revolutionary controls, such as implementing Z-targeting, which became a series staple, all are reasons why this is easily number one. This game is currently playable on the Nintendo Switch via the NSO expansion pack. Number 2. Super Mario 64, released June 23rd, 1996. This and Pilot Wings 64 were the first ever games released for this console. And well, before I start gushing about Mario 64, if you're old like I am and you played this game when it first released, I gotta ask y'all something. Did you happen to get nauseated the first time you played this game? I very clearly remember playing Mario 64 for about 20 minutes and getting nauseous. I had to take a break for about an hour. Let me know this in the comments section below, as I'm curious what all of y'all's experiences on that. For context, I did play Star Fox on the SNES, Jumping Flash on the PS1, Doom, and other first-person shooters before I got into Mario 64, and I'm also not prone to motion sickness either. Anyway, back to Mario 64 itself. It should be no surprise that this is number 2 on the list. Also, being Mario's first 3D adventure, it revolutionized 3D platforming, much like how Super Mario Bros. Did for 2D platformers on the NES. Admittedly, the game is a 10 on the pH scale for how basic it looks, but like the original Super Mario Bros., Mario 64 instead features absolutely fantastic gameplay, with nearly all 120 stars being a blast to get. This game is currently playable on the Nintendo Switch via the NSO expansion pack, as well as on the Super Mario 3D All-Stars for the Switch, though you can't buy it online anymore on the Nintendo's eShop. I've seen retailers have physical copies of Super Mario 3D All-Stars still to this day. Number 3. FZero X, released July 14th, 1998. You can have your Cruisin' Worlds, USA Exoticas, San Francisco Rush, whatever racing games. This is the best one on the Nintendo 64, hands down. The biggest reason is that it was the first game on the 64 to run at 60 frames per second. Considering the difficulty modern games have reaching this feat, it is a thing of amazement that FZero X was able to do this back then. Especially with the fact that there are 30 racers in every race, and, like Zelda and Mario before it, this entry marks the first time the series has gone 3D. To make up for this buttery smooth gameplay, the vehicles themselves are relatively simple polygons, with some of the characteristic fog that appears during races, and many other Nintendo 64 titles like Star Fox and Turok. Regardless, racing is frenetic yet challenging. If the player falls off the course, no Lakitu will come and save you. It's a race over with the player losing a life and starting the race over again. The soundtrack is also amazing, featuring excellent remixes to series classics, as well as guitar and rock-based original tunes. Additional features to leverage the accessory of the 64 disc drive were created for FZero X, which includes a track editor for players to create their own tracks, as well as the ability for the player to create their own cars. It would have been great to have these, though the car creator was possible in the next game in the series, FZero GX for the GameCube. One feature FZero X does have that's pretty cool is the random track generator via the X Cup. All in all, this is a fantastic game and the best racer on a console that has a number of racing games. FZero X is currently playable on the Nintendo Switch via the NSO expansion pack. Number 4. Star Fox 64. Released June 30th, 1997. I played the first SNES iteration of Star Fox, but admittedly I didn't really get into it that much. While seeing 3D on games on the SNES was cool, there was just something about it that just didn't capture my interest. Maybe it was the slow frames per second. Part of me thinks that maybe I just wasn't any good at it and made me lose interest quickly. Either way, whatever issues I had with the original game were not present for me on Star Fox 64. While it too had branching paths like the first game, 64 allows the player to progress through the game in certain paths depending on how well the player performs in a certain mission, or if they complete a certain unnamed task in said mission. From start to successful finish, the game only takes roughly an hour or so to complete, highlighting its arcade-like nature. And highlighting this further is its overall gameplay as a 3D rail shooter game. There are certain times the player's ship, the R-Wing, goes in all-range mode, resulting in gameplay becoming a battlefield-like situation where the player must defeat a number of enemies or bosses. The R-Wing itself handles so smoothly that the couple of missions where the player must pilot a tanker or submarine that they have there feel a little bit jarring. Star Fox 64 also has a number of modes, such as an expert mode, as well as a multiplayer mode where up to 4 players can dogfight one another in the skies. And additional vehicles like the tank, the Landmaster, can be unlocked there. The music suits the various environments and situations great. The story is actually pretty great, and as mentioned, the gameplay is stellar. The game also had a number of aspects turned into memes, like Peppy saying, "Do a barrel roll." I also love the number of pop culture references in the game, such as in the Katina mission essentially being the last battle from the movie Independence Day. Star Fox 64 is currently playable on the Nintendo Switch via NSO expansion pack, and was also remastered on the Nintendo 3DS. Number 5. Mario Kart 64. Released February 10th, 1997. This and the GameCube's Double Dash have the least amount of racetracks, with only 16 total being raceable. Even with this low number, the tracks that are present are quite varied, diverse, and colorful. Being only the second entry in the Mario Kart series, a number of technical advancements were made from its first iteration. Obviously, like all the games mentioned previously, this is the first time the series has made the leap to 3D. Beyond this, and some of the great ways this was implemented, like the Royal Raceway boost jump, as well as a number of the shortcuts that can be taken advantage of, a number of techniques like the mini turbo were added for the first time in the series. While drifting was there in the first iteration on the SNES, creating these mini turbo boosts were not possible then. I loved taking the time to get the quickest times possible in the time trial mode, taking advantage of both the mini turbos and shortcuts whenever possible. I felt because of this, Mario Kart 64 is one of the more technical-based games in the series. Double Dash for the GameCube and Mario Kart Wii got more simplified, most likely to mollify its overall family-friendly base, and for that it sort of lost the charm to me. Regardless, Mario Kart 64 is a fantastic racing game in of itself, one that isn't the friendliest to new players, but is still a great entry in the series overall. This game is currently playable on the Nintendo Switch via the NSO expansion pack. Number 6. Paper Mario. Released February 5th, 2001. I mentioned this game briefly in my general video about video game boycotts. I'll restate what I said there in that I wanted to boycott this game because when it was first revealed as Super Mario RPG 2, I was angry that such a kiddie-looking game could be construed as a true sequel to the great game that was the first Mario RPG. And while the title later became Paper Mario, I will gladly admit I was wrong back then. Paper Mario is one of the fewer RPGs for the Nintendo 64, but it is easily the best one for the console, and one of the best games for the system overall. The story is standard fare for a Mario game. Bowser captures the princess and Mario must save her, while it retreads the original Mario RPG with Mario himself gaining the 7-star spirit's power. Originally, Mario RPG had him get the 7-star pieces. The characters in Paper Mario are the true stars themselves, no pun intended. All of them are quite charming with both the dialogue and the expressive sprites thanks to the paper aesthetic. The music is fantastic as well. There are a myriad of familiar Mario series leitmotifs woven into many of the tracks, as well as a lot of great individual songs. The best part of the game, though, is the simple-to-learn turn-based battle system. This is really meant to be baby's first RPG, which honestly isn't a bad thing at all. If a whole bunch of new RPG fans are being brought into the genre thanks to the likes of Paper Mario and the Pokemon series, I think that's a great thing. I'm kind of like the YouTube content creator RetroBird, and share the general get on my lawn way of thinking. Anyway, the battle system is simple enough, employing the timed hits system from the first Mario RPG, albeit simplified and easier to pull off. There's a bit of platforming in the main world itself, but nothing as quite much like a standard Mario game. And this is the reason why Paper Mario and its sequel, The Thousand Year Door, will probably remain the best in the series. The next game, Super Paper Mario, I felt went too far into the whole platforming aspect of the Paper Mario series and got away too much from the RPG mechanics. Since that game, the Paper Mario series overall hasn't gone back enough to what I feel are a decent RPG system. Nevertheless, we've got the original Paper Mario, deserving of being on the top 10 list here, and it's currently playable on the Nintendo Switch via the NSO expansion pack. Number 7. Super Smash Bros., released April 26, 1999. This, GoldenEye, and the Mario Party games are what made video game parties in the late 90s to very early aughts. Not only is this one of my favorite games for the Nintendo 64, it's also a favorite for a number of my friends as well. The idea for Smash Bros. Came from Masahiro Sakurai, though he presented it as Dragon King the Fighting Game. The models back then looked like generic polygons, which are now recognizable as the Fighting Polygon team from the final game's one-player mode. Looking to make a more recognizable title, Sakurai made a prototype featuring Mario, Donkey Kong, Samus, and Fox, then presented it to Nintendo for approval. And honestly, based on that, I was kind of surprised that it was approved. I never would have thought the family-friendly company would like the idea of its biggest mascots beating the crap out of one another, but thank goodness it did. The mechanics of this original Smash Bros. Are relatively simple, with the singular goal of the player controlling a Nintendo mascot and kicking other mascots off the stage. Damaging opponents to increase their overall percentage results in said opponents flying further when hit with stronger attacks, thus allowing them to be knocked off the stage. Overall gameplay is ingenious in its simplicity, with one button doing standard attacks and another doing special moves unique to each character. Action is frenzied and frenetic when 4 players are fighting all at once, with thankfully no slowdown whatsoever. It's always fun to see the what-if fights, i.e. what would happen if Link actually fought Samus Aran, though the game balances everything out to make it a relatively fair fight between the characters. I still think Kirby is overpowered in this entry. I've got a lot of great memories playing this game with my best friend Mobster as well as Jason the 13th, up until we moved to the superior GameCube's Smash Melee. Still, Super Smash Bros. For the 64 is a great game, and hopefully we'll see Nintendo release this for the NSO expansion pack. As it is, it's not currently available for any current gen system. It was ported to the Wii's Virtual Console, but not anything else since. Number 8. Doom 64. Released April 4th, 1997. This looks like an odd choice, as it's the highest first-person shooter on my list. And Doom 64 doesn't have any multiplayer capability in it at all, and honestly the music isn't all that great. To this latter point, the music itself is more ambient noise than actual music, and it's probably the weakest aspect of the game. Gone is the first 2 entries metal-inspired music, as heard in the background right now, which is a real shame. But beyond this weak point, what is there is what Doom is essentially. Gunplay against hordes of demons in 28 levels, where there are also a few puzzles to work out. I've played Doom and Doom 2 on the PC back in the day, as well as the miracle, albeit crappy SNES port. With this all said, I was absolutely impressed with how smoothly the game ran, and how good all the enemy sprites and environments looked. What you're seeing here in the video looks great, but this is footage from the 2020 remaster from Night Dive Studios. And I'm featuring this because this is the best way on how I recommend playing this entry, as it takes the best of Doom 64 and turns it up to 11. It also contains new levels that story-wise branch this game into Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, if you're worried about story for this series. While I'm not as much, it's still cool to see, and these levels are a great treat. Doom 64 is the best first-person shooter on the Nintendo 64, even beating out Number 9, GoldenEye 007, released August 25th, 1997. Where Doom 64 excels in overall gameplay and function, GoldenEye pretty much excels in everything else. It has great music, a good multiplayer, heck, it has a multiplayer, compelling missions, and is awash in nostalgia. I can't tell you how often I stayed up at night playing this game with my friends, getting into arguments with them on whether or not I or they were screen watching. Spoiler alert, I was, they were, and you did too if you played this with others. For the first time ever, this game got ported and is on the NSO expansion pack, as well as on Xbox Rare Replay. People who may not have played this in years probably weren't too happy to find the confusing control scheme on the Nintendo Switch, but more than that, they may not have been happy to see very slow frame rates and, by today's standard, middling first-person shooter action. Still, for its time, GoldenEye was a gold standard for the genre, at least until Halo thankfully revolutionized first-person shooters further in 2001. I do think GoldenEye's sequels on the Nintendo 64, both direct and spiritual, are objectively better. I'm going to mention them in my honorable mentions shortly. However, GoldenEye itself makes my top 10 for all the nostalgia, paving the way for FPSs on consoles, and for being one of the best licensed-based games since the likes of NES's Batman and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time. Number 10. Diddy Kong Racing, released November 24th, 1997. This was probably the first non-Mario-led kart racer I played, and there's a ton of them now. Still, this great little racer brought a lot that Mario Kart didn't have. For one thing, what Mario Kart 64 had in technique and skill, I felt Diddy Kong Racing had in sheer speed and vehicle variety. Before the days of flying anti-gravity karts and motorcycles, Mario Kart was just relegated to karts. Yeah, Diddy Kong Racing had them too, but they also had hovercraft and airplanes. While I felt piloting hovercraft honestly sucked, the karts and planes did control wonderfully. Instead of Mario Kart's item boxes, Diddy Kong Racing had a number of different balloons for both offensive and defensive capabilities, stackable by collecting multiple of the same type. Also, Diddy Kong's racing adventure had exactly that, an adventure mode. While this would often involve doing the same races over and over again, and sometimes having to collect annoying Nintendo 64 coins, I mean, it's not a rare game if it isn't an incessant collectathon, it at least provided players an environment to explore that connected the main objective of defeating the evil Whizpig. I enjoyed the many varied musical tracks in the game, although while we're discussing sound, I felt the game leaned a bit heavily on the kiddiness of it all. Hearing the Diddy laugh in the beginning of the game lends itself to this. Check the link attached in the description below for more info on the Diddy laugh. It also helped to further lean Nintendo more into its kid-friendly perception in a time where the PlayStation 1 strongly swayed older audiences to it. Anyway, Diddy Kong Racing had a great multiplayer mode that allowed players to use the 3 vehicles on the 20 total tracks. There were some limitations applied where certain vehicles couldn't be used in certain tracks. It also was the introductory game for Rare's characters Banjo and Conker. They didn't return for the updated port that released on the Nintendo DS in February 2007. While Rare is owned by Microsoft now, there's still a chance the original version of Diddy Kong Racing could release on the NSO expansion pack, since Rare's GoldenEye did release as well, and so did Banjo-Kazooie. Now, if I allowed the list of Nintendo 64 games to go as high as a top 25, I'd have some decent contenders for each of those. With that said, I do have to give some honorable mentions here. And while I didn't really get into the sports genre that much, the 64 did have a number of great sports games. These include the likes of 1080, Snowboarding, and Wave Race 64, though some of my favorite sports games were WWF No Mercy, NBA Courtside, and Mario Tennis 64. Wait, is a WWF wrestling game a sports title, since technically all the matches are choreographed, up to and including who is supposed to win? Either way, the action in this title is very real, and while it may not look great nowadays, it was a ton of fun. Also great was NBA Courtside, a decent basketball game. It was no NBA Jam or anything, but I still had fun with it. And as mentioned again, also fun was Mario Tennis 64, which taught me how to play tennis, up to and including the odd scoring system. I mentioned it briefly in the main top 10, but another two titles deserving honorable mention: The World Is Not Enough 007 and Perfect Dark. The former is the official sequel to GoldenEye, since it took place chronologically after, but it was developed by EA and not Rareware. Perfect Dark, though, was developed by Rare, and it just feels like the spiritual successor to GoldenEye. To that end, the environments, characters, and especially story relate nothing to the whole 007 universe. Both titles used the expansion pack and keep the tradition of fantastic multiplayer that GoldenEye itself had started. Another honorable mention goes to Rareware's 3D platformers of Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie. They managed to capture the same spirit of exploration and adventure that Super Mario 64 did, though infusing it with the take it or leave it collectathon that encompasses Rare's platformers. Still, the Bird and the Bear combo are iconic. Supporting characters and enemies are fun and memorable, and the controls are decent. While Rare also made Donkey Kong 64, that took the collectathon aspect way too far, especially since much of this was needed just to be able to beat that game. Just like the predictable number 1 on my top 10, one game for the Nintendo 64 I haven't mentioned yet also gets slotted in for an honorable mention, and that would be Majora's Mask. This entry was a darker turn for the Zelda series, featuring a number of themes not really seen in said series before. But this one's not a favorite for me personally. I hated starting off as a Deku Shrub in the beginning of the game, the overall time loop causing the loss of collectible items and rupees, and especially how heavy the game was with side quests. Oh man, did I dislike the side quests, especially with how oftentimes they'd be reliant on not only where they would be triggered, but when in the 72 hours the game loops through. I also hated that there were only 4 dungeons in the game, as well as the tedium of having to switch between the various masks, especially when statues had to be made of them later using the Elegy of Emptiness. Even with all my gripes, still a solid enough game that was worth mentioning, at least here in this video. And so that's my list of top 10 video games for the Nintendo 64. As you saw, I ran it differently than my other top 10 videos because, well, the Nintendo 64 was quite a different system for its time and generation. Now, what are some of your favorite titles for the 64? How much does your list match mine, or am I missing some titles, like Pokemon Stadium, Pilotwings 64, and Blues Brothers 2000? Let me know in the comments section below. Please like, subscribe, and ring that bell for notifications of new content. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.